I would like to welcome Professor Norrin Ripsman from Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Professor Ripsman is one of those extremely able scholars. I don't think there are many scholars who could claim, as he will, that he will have 3 books coming out in 2016, including the long-awaited neoclassical realist theory of international relations, which I'm sure is going to interest a great many of us. Of course, to the academic circuit, he's most famous for this book, Neoclassical Realism, the State and Foreign Policy, Cambridge University Press, which is something as strange or curious as a theoretical bestseller. Professor Ripsman got his PhD from University of Pennsylvania. He has worked a great many different places, including at Harvard and Northern Illinois University. He is here to talk about, not as it was initially listed, about illiberal liberalism, but on the contrary, does promoting democracy promote peace? And of course, this is a topic that is of great interest in this house, being the Nobel Institute, and our continuous search for the causes of peace. Professor Ripsman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Asla, and I have to say it's a great honor and privilege to be here and to speak to you. I thank you very much for inviting me. I should start with the disclaimer that I arrived yesterday and my brain is badly jet-lagged and somewhere over the Atlantic right now, so I hope you'll bear that in mind. Certainly come question and answer time, but seriously, let me start with a joke. And I wanted to start with a joke that was au courant at the time of the early post-Cold War era. The president of a newly independent former communist state faced a significant dilemma at the time of the opening of Parliament, because he was very eager to show his credentials to the West. There'd be Western dignitaries in the audience, and he was very eager to show his credentials, his country's credentials as a democracy, in order to be able to get Western aid, economic and military aid, which was of great importance. And as a result, he wanted to have the first speaker set the right tone. And he thought, should I call on the leader of the Communist Party? Maybe that's a good idea, because the West doesn't like communists, but they do like forgiveness. They do like to have a clear indication that we're turning our back on the bad old days, and that even the Communist Party leader can come and give a talk. But he thought, that's probably not a good idea. The Communist Party leader is a very unfriendly individual, and on his mind, more than anything else, is punishing the great treason that occurred in overthrowing the system, and he'll probably get up and start talking about hanging the traitors, and that's not very good from the point of view of the optics for the West. So he thought, well, I could ask the Nationalist Party leader. The West doesn't like nationalists that much, but on the other hand, it would show a clear break from the communist past. Maybe that's a good idea. And then he thought again and thought, that's not a very good idea after all, because what's he going to do? He's going to talk about drowning the minorities, and I don't think that'll play well in the New York Times. So then he came upon a brilliant idea. I'll ask the Nationalist Party leader. That sounds great. I'll ask the Green Party leader. Green Party leader would be wonderful. She's going to get up, and she's going to talk about environmental degradation in former communist times. She's going to talk about the need to restore the environment. That's exactly what the West wants to hear. So that's what he decided on, and on the auspicious day, he got up to the podium, and he invited the Green Party leader to be the first speaker to inaugurate Parliament. And she got up, she thanked him, and she said, Mr. President, and she looked at the Western dignitaries in the audience. He said, Mr. President, communist times were very hard on our country. They were horrible for our country. The environmental damage that was inflicted on our country was so great and unbelievable that we will probably never recover from it. Think of what they did to our beautiful forests. In many cases, they simply razed forests, leaving not a single tree standing. That's a horrible thing that they've done. In addition, look at pollution of our beautiful national rivers that they engaged in when they had these factories spewing out filth into our rivers, and they've clogged them up so that you can't even move around in them. She says, no trees, no rivers. And then she looks at the camera and looks at the Western dignitaries and she says, where will we hang our traitors? Where will we drown our minorities? Clearly, democracy does not cure all problems, which brings me to the prevailing Western attitudes towards democracy and conflict resolution. Okay, a central assumption that runs through Western policy towards troubled regions is that democracy promotion is a key to resolving international conflicts. For example, US President Bill Clinton's National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, devised a strategy called enlargement to replace the Cold War strategy of containment. And enlargement was premised on, amongst other things, spreading democracy and free trade as a means of spreading peace and stability worldwide. His successor, George W. Bush, opted to use force to democratize Iraq as a means of spreading peace and stability to the Middle East, which has very little of it. His, current President, Barack Obama, from this actual podium, stated that, I believe that peace is unstable where citizens are denied the right to speak freely or worship as they please, choose their own leaders or assemble without fear. He clearly also made the link between spreading democracy and spreading peace and stability. But not just in the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stressed repeatedly that democratization of the Arab states is a prerequisite for stable Arab-Israeli peacemaking. My own country, Canada, has made democracy promotion in the Americas as a means of spreading stability a core component of its hemispheric policy program, also believing that spreading democracy spreads peace and stability. Not only do Western policymakers believe that democracy promotes peace, but this view also has currency in the Western media and in Western culture more broadly, and certainly, dare I say it, in the Western Academy. My purpose today is to explore this hypothesized linkage between democratization, peacemaking, and stability, both theoretically and with empirical analysis. The belief that they are positively linked is based on liberal international relations theory, and in particular, the very popular democratic peace theory, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, which assumes that democratic states are unlikely to wage war against each other for institutional and normative reasons. But that's only one perspective within the literature. Democratic peace theory isn't the only perspective on the effects of democracy and international stability. Traditional political realists, in particular, believe that democracy can actually do the reverse, promote instability and war, and are poorly equipped to make peace. Whereas structural realists, the neo-realists, believe that democracies behave no differently from other regimes. I'm going to begin my talk, therefore, with an overview of liberal and realist theoretical perspectives on democracy and foreign affairs. Liberal theorists have long argued that democracies are superior to authoritarian states in the practice of foreign affairs. Immanuel Kant and Baron de Montesquieu, for example, argue that in authoritarian regimes, the foreign policy apparatus tends to be abused by the leader to further his or her own parochial interests rather than the national interest. In republican regimes, however, public input serves as a check on the ambitions of state leaders. Kant writes in one of these glorious extended quotations that I'm going to read to you, "If, as must be so under this Constitution, the consent of the subjects is required to determine whether there shall be war or not, nothing is more natural than that they should weigh the matter well before undertaking such a bad business. For in decreeing war, they would of necessity be resolving to bring down the miseries of war upon their country. This implies they must fight themselves. They must hand over the costs of war out of their own property. They must do their poor best to make good the devastation which it leaves behind. And finally, as the crowning ill, they have to accept a burden of debt which will embitter even peace itself, and which they can never pay off on account of the new wars which are always impending." On the other hand, in a government where the subject is not a citizen holding a vote, the plunging into war is the least serious thing in the world. For the ruler is not a citizen, but the owner of the state, and does not lose a whit by the war, while he goes on enjoying the delights of his table or sport, or of his pleasure palaces and gala days. He can therefore decide on war for the most trifling reasons, as if it were a kind of pleasure party. Consequently, according to Montesquieu, democracies tend in general terms to be more peaceful, since the people are less inclined to sanction a war for which they will bear the cost. Most empirical studies, however, have failed to confirm that democracies are more peaceful than non-democratic states. Instead, they tend to go to war about as often as other states. This may be the case because nationalism and other hostile public sentiments can actually motivate democratic states to choose war, democratic leaders to choose war. Alternatively, the causal arrow might run in the other direction. That is, democratic leaders themselves may inspire hatred and hostility amongst the electorate in order to facilitate military action. Regardless, despite the fact that democracies are not more peaceful overall than other states, it has been frequently observed that they rarely, if ever, wage war against other democratic states. This has inspired perhaps the most popular theory in international relations theory, that is, democratic peace theory. Contemporary liberals argue that it's no accident that democracies don't wage war with each other. Instead, democratic peace theorists maintain that certain features of democratic states make them unlikely to wage war against each other. And there's a normative explanation and a structural explanation. Normative features and structural features. The normative explanation is that democratic societies reject coercion as a means of securing consent. They do so domestically. You can have an argument or a dispute with your neighbor as long as you don't use force or threaten your neighbor in any way. The same norm is externalized to other free peoples, and other democratic states are understood to be societies of other free peoples expressing their will freely. Therefore, if they have a dispute with another democratic state, they'll press their leaders to resolve it without force, and if force is the only way to win the dispute, they'll back off, since they view the rights of the other state, of the other free people, as legitimate if distasteful. On the other hand, if they have a dispute with a non-democratic state, they may use force. Since they consider the non-democratic state as illegitimate, they consider the government's policy preferences as divorced from the preferences of the population as a whole, and therefore it's perfectly legitimate to wage war under the circumstances, normative democratic peace theorists argue. The structural explanation is that democracies take time. They need time to mobilize a reluctant legislature and the public before declaring war. Because, of course, for the reasons that Kant and Montesquieu mentioned, the public doesn't like war, nor do its representatives in the legislature. This time, this need to mobilize, creates time that other democracies will use. First, it's a very obvious, open process, and the other democratic state, therefore, can use that time in order to find some non-violent means of resolving the dispute. Whereas non-democratic states will tend to see that same mobilization process and do one of two things, structural democratic peace theorists argue. Either they will dig in and prepare for war on more favorable terms, or they may even preempt and strike first to get a first mover advantage and therefore commence a war on more favorable terms. The logic of democratic peace theory underpins the Western assumption that spreading democracy to troubled regions is necessarily going to expand the zone of democratic peace, because democratic norms and peaceful publics, they assume, will rein in bellicose leaders. This is very much a bottom-up theory. Societal norms and societal demands, therefore, restrain bellicose leaders who would use force, according to this understanding. Now, traditional realist theorists, however, are very skeptical about both the utility of democracies in the international arena, as well as the pacifying influence and stabilizing influence that these democracies may foster. In his classic, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville concluded that while democracy was promising as an instrument of domestic prosperity and order, it lacked the ability to conduct foreign affairs on equal footing with authoritarian regimes. He wrote, "As for myself, I do not hesitate to say that it is especially in the conduct of their foreign relations that democracies appear to me decidedly inferior to other governments. Foreign politics demands scarcely any of those qualities which are peculiar to a democracy. They require, on the contrary, the perfect use of almost all of those in which it is deficient. Democracy is favorable to the increase of the internal resources of the state. It diffuses wealth and comfort, promotes public spirit, and fortifies the respect for law in all classes of society. All of these are advantages which have only an indirect influence over the relations which one people bears to another. But a democracy can only with great difficulty regulate the details of an important undertaking, persevere in a fixed design, and work out its execution in spite of serious obstacles. It cannot combine its measures with secrecy or await their consequences with patience. These are qualities which more especially belong to an individual or an aristocracy, and they are precisely the qualities by which a nation, like an individual, attains a dominant position. Pioneers of the traditional realist school, such as Hans Morgenthau, Walter Lippmann, Reinhold Niebuhr, and George Kennan, amongst others, shared de Tocqueville's pessimism about democratic foreign policy. Traditional realists conclude that public input into the policy process can undermine the national interest, which for realists is the rational basis of all policy. Indeed, Morgenthau went so far as to write, "A foreign policy carried out under democratic control must fall short of the rational requirements for good foreign policy, for it must satisfy emotional preferences whose satisfaction is incompatible with meeting those requirements." This leads democracies to tailor policies to public whims rather than international requirements, which can be fatal in a hostile international environment, which realists are quick to point out is always the case. In general, traditional realists have pointed to the following 7 shortcomings of democracies because of public control over policy and time-consuming democratic processes. First of all, they tend to underinvest in military capability, since the public favors domestic spending and lower taxes. Hence, their ability to deter potential adversaries is undermined. Again, this makes war more likely as far as traditional realists are concerned. And in fact, they're usually unprepared for the military involvements that are thrust upon them. Second of all, realists charge that democracies are war-averse. Consequently, they're slow to respond when force is required to prevent a hostile power from disrupting the balance of power. Furthermore, this well-known reluctance to go to war actually encourages revisionist states to act aggressively without fear of reprisal. In other words, this actually undermines stability. Third, they tend to place universalist ideologies above interests, making democracy and human rights their priorities rather than concrete material interests in order to enlist public support. Fourth, democracies lack flexibility, according to realists, since it takes a considerable amount of time to mobilize public and legislative opinion in support of a policy change. Fifth, they frequently project disunity and dissension because of this very open public debate over policy ends. This interferes with their ability to send clear signals to potential adversaries. Read, this undermines deterrence, which of course realists say is destabilizing. Sixth, they're incapable of secrecy, which hinders them in critical negotiations and deprives them of the element of surprise that's essential to all military operations. And finally, and very importantly for our purposes, they're averse to limited war, since public passions, when stirred up, rarely give way to moderation. This hinders reconciliation with former enemies when the balance of power requires these states to do so. In other words, democracy complicates peacemaking rather than facilitates it. Kennan's overall assessment of democracies in the international realm, therefore, is rather negative. He writes, "I sometimes wonder whether in this respect a democracy is not uncomfortably similar to one of the prehistoric monsters with a body as long as this room and a brain the size of a pin. He lies there in his comfortable primeval mud and pays little attention to his environment. He's slow to wrath. In fact, you practically have to whack his tail off to make him aware that his interests are even being disturbed. But once he grasps this, he lays about him with such blind determination that he not only destroys his adversary, but largely wrecks his native habitat." Traditional realists, therefore, believe that democracies are dysfunctional in international affairs, and promoting democracies within troubled regions should only compound stability rather than encouraging peacemaking. This is especially the case because traditional realists view the public as unwilling to compromise with their enemies for peace, whereas the state itself, according to realists, is far too pragmatic to hold grudges when it's unwise to do so for strategic reasons. If anything, therefore, democratic institutions and public participation in the policy process should interfere with peacemaking. There's a third perspective. Structural realists, or neo-realists as they're frequently called, expect democracy promotion to be largely inconsequential to international affairs and conflict stability. For Waltzian structural realists, domestic regime types are largely irrelevant to international politics in general. States, regardless of how they're constituted, have to navigate the constraints and opportunities of the international system. Behavior at odds with systemic pressures could be disastrous for states and could lead to deselection or defeat in war. Therefore, the international system privileges those states that are perfectly flexible, and democracies have to learn that inflexible behavior doesn't succeed. Over time, therefore, Waltz's socialization mechanism suggests that states are socialized to conduct foreign policy consistently with these imperatives, regardless of whether they're democratic or authoritarian. In Waltz's lesser-known book, Foreign Policy and Democratic Politics, for example, he concludes that Great Britain and the United States both navigated the early Cold War admirably, despite being democracies, and there were really not many differences despite their unique democratic structures. They're distinct and unique democratic structures. Thus, from a structural point of view, peacemaking should occur when systemic pressures require it, that is, when the rise of a greater threat or perhaps great power pressures require it, and only based on strategic imperatives rather than because of democratic norms or institutions. We thus have these three views on democracy and international stability and peacemaking. The liberal view that democracies promote stability and peacemaking, the traditional realist view that they promote instability and interfere with peacemaking, and the structural realist position that in fact they are no more or less stabilizing than other regimes, therefore they should have no effect on peacemaking whatsoever. Now, to some extent, I've been investigating this debate in some form or another my entire career. From my first book, Peacemaking by Democracies, which examined the impact of public opinion on the security policies of democratic states and the dynamic of interstate bargaining amongst democracies, to my forthcoming book next year, Peacemaking from Above, Peace from Below, which considers whether stable peace tends to originate with the state or with state or societal incentives. Today I'm going to discuss evidence from two peace processes involving a full-fledged democracy and a democratizing rival to see whether spreading democracy generates improved societal attitudes towards the rival state or the rival entity and its population, and whether societal pressures to make peace occur as well, as democratic peace theorists would expect, whether increased instability occurs, as traditional realists would expect, or whether movements towards peace, when they occur, are made by leaders for strategic reasons over societal objections, as structural realists would expect. The first case study that I'm going to talk about, the first case that I'll discuss, is France and Federal Republic of Germany from 1949 to 1955. After World War II, Great Britain, France, and the United States occupied the western zones of Germany, and by 1949, established the Federal Republic of Germany, a fully democratic regime, which held its first elections in August of 1949. The transition of Western Germany from an enemy authoritarian state to a Western-occupied nation, and finally to a liberal democracy, did not, however, transform French public attitudes towards the German people or toward the new West German regime in this period. Indeed, even after the new democratic regime was established and the first free election took place, the French public continued to distrust the Germans and resist their incorporation in Western political, economic, and military coalitions. In February 1950, for example, a Gallup poll revealed that the majority of French respondents believed that France should not have cordial relations with the new West German regime, not even cordial relations. In May of 1953, 70% of decided French respondents judged that, and this is a quote from the question, the existence of German troops constitutes a danger for France. In June 1953, almost as many French respondents judged that Germany was France's primary enemy rather than the Soviet Union, as judged the Soviet Union was the primary enemy. As late as July 1954, 5 years after the establishment of German democracy, and a year significantly after the Federal Republic experienced its second free and fair election, the French public continued to fear the Germans, whom they believed, quote, deeply loved war and viewed them as a threat to French security. As a result, by a margin of greater than 2 to 1, they opposed German rearmament and resisted German entry into NATO. Thus, democratization did not improve French public attitudes towards Germany or the German people, as liberal theorists would have expected that it would have done. The French public's distrust of German democracy should not be too surprising, given that Hitler's militaristic regime grew out of the 14-year Weimar democracy. After all, democracy then had not been a guarantee of peace, and the consequences of the previous lapse into authoritarianism had been very severe for France, as the Nazis had occupied most of the country. Nonetheless, public distrust underscores the fact that the French leadership was far more conciliatory toward the former enemy than the French public was, even if their moderation was grounded in Cold War pragmatism, rather than any affinity towards the Germans. The Cold War pragmatism depended on a few things. First of all, the Western powers needed German help in order to counter the far more serious Soviet threat. And the French were also were particularly dependent on Marshall Plan aid, and the United States had made Marshall Plan aid to France dependent on the inclusion of Germany within the Marshall Plan as well, and German recovery. As a consequence of this disagreement between French leaders and the French public, because of the fragile multi-party political structure of the French Fourth Republic, which afforded the National Security Executive very little structural autonomy to pursue unpopular policies, the French government dragged its feet and frustrated free power attempts to reintegrate the Germans that the government itself actually viewed as essential for French security and the French economy. Initially, although Robert Schuman and his government favored relaxing the three-power industrial dismantling and limitation regime imposed on Germany, he delayed Anglo-American efforts to relax restrictions on the German economy on the grounds that domestic outrage at such a move in France could actually topple the government. Schuman thus made it clear to his allies that, and I quote from American documents, he realizes full well that a good part of French policy towards Germany is not realistic, but the French people in general do not realize that. Nonetheless, because American efforts to revive the German economy unleashed in France, again from the American documents, a veritable groundswell of public outrage that Schuman could not ignore, the French government would have to tread very carefully. For this reason, the French government did not agree to scrap industrial limitations on Germany until the launch of the Schuman Plan in 1952, which sought to bind the potentially dangerous German coal and steel industry to those in France. In the security realm, France was even more cautious due to domestic opinion. Although the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 persuaded Bidault, Premier René Pleven, Schuman, and others in the government that limited German rearmament as a bulwark against the Soviet Union was essential for French security, and although the French General Staff actually had advocated that as far back as the Berlin blockade in 1948, successive French governments nonetheless delayed the equipment of German forces for 5 years due to powerful domestic opposition to German military participation in Western defense. Notably, when the Americans pressed for 12 German divisions at the September 1950 NATO meetings in New York, Schuman indicated that his government actually agreed with the need for German units and would be willing to agree secretly in order to begin German rearmament, provided that the equipment of German units would actually proceed secretly. When American Secretary of State Dean Acheson vetoed any kind of secret agreement, the French government resisted German rearmament by imposing unrealistic conditions that gummed up the works. Furthermore, after proposing a complex European defense community framework for including German defense contribution, 3 successive governments, led by, respectively, Antoine Pinay, René Maillet, and Joseph Laniel, 3 governments that actually favored both the EDC and limited German rearmament, shied away from introducing that for a ratification vote in the Assemblée Nationale because they feared that the EDC treaty would be defeated by opponents of German rearmament. Thus, French domestic hostility to the Germans interfered with the German government's efforts to reintegrate the enemy, as traditional realists would have expected, the former enemy, as traditional realists would have expected. The French experience in constructing a post-war settlement with the Federal Republic after World War II then suggests that after a war, even several years afterwards, domestic populaces are more hostile to former enemies than their leaders and can actually interfere with constructive settlement. Moreover, this mistrust and hostility does not abate after the former enemy democratizes. Thus, the post-World War II reconciliation between France and Germany was a top-down peace with the French public as an obstacle, kicking and screaming, in accordance with traditional realists rather than a bottom-up peace that democratic peace theory would lead us to expect. And the fact that with intense Anglo-American pressure, the French executive was ultimately able to push through a peace with the Federal Republic in late 1954, despite public and legislative opposition, supports the structural realist view that when the stakes are high enough, even democratic states will be able to overcome their domestic deficiencies. Let me talk about a second case. Even though the second case is Israel and the Palestinian Authority in the 1990s. Even though this involved a democratic state and a democratizing non-state entity rather than two sovereign states, it's also worth investigating and is instructive. The 1993 Oslo Accords represented a sea change for the Israeli democracy. Not only did the governments of Yitzhak Rabin negotiate with the PLO, an organization that the bulk of Israeli society viewed as an illegitimate terrorist organization, it granted official recognition to the PLO, it created a PLO-led Palestinian Authority, and agreed to a staged transfer of territory to PA control as a prelude to a negotiated final settlement. That Rabin and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres negotiated this treaty with the PLO despite a widespread Israeli consensus that Israel should never recognize the PLO at the time, is evidence that peacemaking on the Israeli side was a top-down process driven by leaders who were more conciliatory than the public. Nonetheless, what's more interesting for my purposes is what happened subsequently. Given the quasi-democratic character that the PA developed after Oslo. In particular, as part of the Declaration of Principles between Israel and the PLO, Oslo I, signed in 1993, the PA created representative institutions of government. Significantly, Article 1 and Article 3 of the agreement established the Palestinian Legislative Council, an elected assembly to represent the Palestinian people in the final status peace negotiations and to administer the territory that Israel would be relinquishing to Palestinian control. In the Oslo II Agreement of 1995, Article 2 and the annexes specified an electoral procedure that would include international monitoring to ensure fairness. In January 1996, the PA held an election according to these rules. Notably, the election was monitored by an international team led by former US President Jimmy Carter, who lent credibility to the results, even though there were reports of fraud and ballot stuffing. Moreover, although PLO leader Yasser Arafat won approximately 90% of the vote for president, many of his hand-picked Fatah candidates for council seats were actually defeated by independents who were very critical of Arafat, which also lent credibility to the results of the vote. Thus, at least until 2001, by then there was cumulative evidence of widespread allegations of PA corruption and repeated postponement of subsequent elections, which provided evidence to the contrary. But until 2001, there was reason for Israeli leaders and the Israeli public to conclude that the Palestinian leadership had begun a process of democratization in the post-Oslo period. So it's useful for us to see how that affected Israeli public attitudes towards the Palestinians and towards the peace process between this period of 1996 and 2001. Israeli public attitudes towards the Palestinians during this period and towards peacemaking during this period are actually rather complex, and there are different dimensions that I think we need to focus on. On one hand, once Rabin announced that he'd achieved a diplomatic breakthrough with the PLO in 1993, a majority of the public, a large majority of the public, consistently supported the peace process in every public opinion poll taken. This remained the case even after the Israeli public elected right-wing Likud leader and Oslo Accord critic Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister in 1996. Indeed, according to the Peace Index polls conducted by the Steinmetz Center for Peace Research at Tel Aviv University, from October 1996 through February 2001, even after the failure of the August 2000 Camp David summit and the subsequent Palestinian Intifada, support for the peace process remained at no less than 70% of the Jewish Israeli public, even as the Israeli public rejected labor leader Ehud Barak in favor of the anti-Oslo Sharon. So they changed governments, but they didn't change this commitment to a peace process with the Palestinians. The thing is that this support for the peace process with the Palestinians was not consistently matched by Israeli attitudes towards the 1993 Oslo Agreement with the PLO. In October of 1996, the year of the Palestinian Legislative Council election, 47% of decided Israeli respondents reported that they actually supported Oslo, almost twice as many as opposed it. Yet at other times during this period, support for Oslo tailed off considerably. In April of 1997, for example, after a high-profile terrorist bombing of a cafe in Tel Aviv shook many Israelis' confidence in the Palestinian Authority, only 33.5% of decided respondents actually supported Oslo, whereas that was only marginally more than the 30% who actually opposed it. Following the violence of September 2000, despite the strong majority in favor of the peace process, attitudes changed considerably, and 47% opposed the Oslo Agreement at that point, whereas only 36% supported it. So there's strong support for the peace process, but varying support, very limited support over this period for the Oslo Agreement itself. In addition, public opinion data actually showed very little optimism about peace during this period as well. Very little optimism that the peace process would lead to a stable peace settlement. In October of 1996, although most Israelis supported the Oslo Agreement and favored peacemaking, they were split down the middle, 40-40, who actually ventured an opinion, 40% to 40% on whether, quote, the Oslo Agreement between Israel and the PLO will bring about peace between Israel and the Palestinians in the coming years. So they favored peacemaking, but really weren't sure about whether it would work. Only 8 months later, after the cafe bombing, 45% of decided respondents in the poll expected that the Oslo Agreement would actually fail, while only 35% believed that it could bring about peace. By October of 2000, only 24% believed that Oslo would lead to peace, whereas an overwhelming 63% doubted that peace would ever be reached. This complex picture of an Israeli public consistently committed to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinian people, only somewhat supportive of the Oslo Agreement, but very skeptical that all of this peacemaking would actually bring about a stable peace, should be augmented by two additional dimensions of public attitudes towards the peace process. First, although most supported the Oslo framework between 1993 and 1996, the majority consistently reported their irrevocable opposition to a Palestinian state, regardless of what agreement was signed in the end. In addition, the large minority that opposed the Oslo Agreement and the smaller minority that opposed the entire peace process was very vocal, engaging in high-profile demonstrations against the agreement and any governments that upheld it. This significance is all the greater since these groups constituted the support base for Israel's right-wing and religious parties, at least some of which were in every single governing coalition during this period. And given the Israeli fragile multi-party structure, which I can compare very much to the French Fourth Republic, very unstable, even a single party can bring down a government, as often happened during this time period. Happened more than once anyway during this time period. And therefore, the fact that these groups underpinned, provided the support base for all of these parties who participated in the government was quite politically significant. Thus, the Israeli public did not reward the Palestinians for their initial movement toward democracy, as democratic peace theorists might have expected them to. The Israeli leadership's interest in peacemaking also waxed and waned between Rabin's tenure as prime minister and that of Ehud Barak's. But on the whole, it was more or less committed to the Oslo process for strategic reasons. Initially, Rabin and Peres reached the conclusion that on strategic grounds, a negotiated settlement with the PLO was essential for Israeli security. With the end of the Cold War, Rabin calculated that Israel could no longer rely on its utility as an American ally, as a source of both the economic and military assistance that was essential to Israeli security. Furthermore, in the absence of a peace agreement, Israel feared that they faced an untenable position in the territories they occupied since the '67 war. Unless they were to return the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the high Palestinian birth rate would mean that the Palestinians would outnumber the Jewish population of Israel within a generation, and thus either the Jewish character of the State of Israel or its democratic character would necessarily suffer at that point. And given the centrality of this idea of a Jewish and democratic state, this was very problematic for Rabin and Peres. Furthermore, in the wake of the Gulf War, in which the United States secured the cooperation of a variety of Arab states, Washington placed considerable pressure on Israel to resolve the conflict with the Palestinians as payment for Arab cooperation. For these strategic reasons, the Israeli leadership decided to make unprecedented contributions to the PLO in return for a peace settlement. After breaking ground with the Oslo Agreement, the Rabin-Peres government cautiously went about implementing these agreements and shepherding the public along with them. Now, even in the wake of a spate of terrorist bombings in 1994, Rabin and Peres turned aside public calls for revenge and a suspension of the Oslo agreements, instead resolving not to let fanatics stand in the way of peace, which was the discourse that they engaged in at the time. Significantly, though, even Netanyahu, a professed opponent of Oslo, but at the time a moderate within the Likud party, moved the process forward during his tenure by initialing the Hebron Agreement of January 1997 and the Wye River Memorandum of October of 1998, much to the dismay of his own political supporters at the time. Barak, Netanyahu's successor, altered the plan of December 2000, and then ultimately the plan on the table at the Taba talks, offering 95% of the West Bank plus territorial compensation to make up the equivalent of 100% of the territory. It's clear then that under Labor leadership, the Israeli government was on the whole more conciliatory toward the PA than the Israeli public was, as it was unwilling to slow down the peace process due to terrorist attacks, as most of the public was, and was consistently far ahead of the public when it came to concessions towards the PA. But in addition, even Netanyahu was more dovish than his political support base, which wanted him to tear up the Oslo agreements and certainly not go ahead with the redeployment. Furthermore, at several key stages, sizable segments of Israeli society staged public demonstrations to slow down the pace of negotiations and limit concessions to the PA. Thus, while it would be inaccurate to label the public as a whole bellicose, because the majority at the time did support the project of peacemaking, it's nonetheless clear that the peace process was driven by Israeli leaders for strategic reasons rather than by the people, who were more tentative and more cautious than the political leadership. This fits a structural realist frame, as Israeli leaders were able to drive the peace process at times despite a less enthusiastic and often hostile public. Consistently with traditional realism, however, both the Israeli and the Palestinian public actually served as obstacles to peacemaking. The Israeli public complicated peacemaking in a couple of ways. First of all, it elected more reluctant governments on two occasions. First in 1996, the Netanyahu government, and then after the Al-Aqsa Intifada broke out in September of 2000, in 2001, they elected the Sharon government. Again, a more hostile government, and therefore their choice was to try to slow down the peace process at the time. In addition to that, they also punished, Netanyahu's support base also punished him for signing the Hebron Agreement and made him far more reluctant and far more careful afterwards, because his support base abandoned him, the party in his coalition left, and his own nationalist supporters started protesting against him at that time period, and as a result made him very cautious lest he would actually lose the ability to govern and keep his coalition stable. Now, there's also reason to conclude that the Palestinian public's hostility to any compromise on the Palestinian right of return and its unwillingness to accept a final settlement, a final agreement based on the 67 lands, led Arafat to reject the Camp David II plan and subsequent plans proposed by Clinton and Barack. Thus, the two realist positions fare better in explaining this case than democratic peace liberalism. So where are we after looking at these two cases? These cases clearly don't support the liberal view that promoting democracy promotes peacemaking and stability. Although a stable peace eventually did develop between France and the Federal Republic of Germany, peace did not result from democratization, nor did the French public, or even French leaders for that matter, believe that German democracy was a sufficient basis to restrain German militarism. Moreover, the French public and the legislature acted as a brake on the peace process between 1950 and 1954. This is much more consistent with realist theory than with liberal theory, as is the fact that the French ultimately made peace with the Federal Republic for reasons of power politics over the objections of the public and significant portions of the legislature. The failure to reach an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement after the Oslo agreements does not in itself confirm the traditional realist position that democratization perpetuates instability, since it's not that's not a fair test of the liberal argument, since the PA never made the full transition to democracy. Nonetheless, the fact that the Israeli democratic process and both the Israeli and Palestinian publics served as obstacles to peacemaking actually is consistent with traditional realism. Finally, consistent with structural realism, in both these cases, the impetus for peacemaking came from national leaders for strategic reasons, rather than from the public because of the adversary's democratization. Leaders of each of these democracies pragmatically engaged the adversary and made concessions in the face of considerable domestic political opposition, often at great political and personal risk. While the level of public opposition varied in these cases, the vast majority of the French public after World War II was hostile to any kind of political, economic, and military concessions towards the Germans, whereas in contrast, most of the time, over 50% of the Israeli public favored concessions to the Palestinians. It's clear that the political leadership was, on the whole, throughout the time period, more conciliatory than society as a whole, and that leaders made concession first and brought the public on board where they were able to afterwards. Overall, then, realist predictions perform better than liberal ones for these cases. At times, when the international imperatives are compelling, national leaders can pursue a peacemaking agenda despite democratic opposition. But at other, which is consistent with the traditional realist story, at other times, traditional with the systemic realist, structural realist story, at other times the dysfunctional traits of democracies that traditional realists identify win out. Now, of course, Asla's smiling and thinking that this is perfectly consistent and is just waiting for a neoclassical realist theory to explain why sometimes the system wins out and sometimes domestic politics wins out, and that's exactly where Stephen Nobel, Jeff Taliaferro, and I are headed in our book, which comes out next year. But either way, this is contrary to the expectations of structural democratic peace theory and liberal theory more broadly, which assumes that the public is always more peaceful than its leaders. Furthermore, it's problematic even for normative democratic peace theory, which would predict that once the opponent began to democratize, public opinion should have become more conciliatory towards the former enemy. Therefore, we need to be careful about embracing the logic of democratic peace theory as a strategy for peacemaking and spreading stability. This does not mean, I want to be very clear on this does not mean that I think we should abandon the project of democracy promotion. Far from it. Nonetheless, we must not view democracy promotion as a panacea for international conflict and need to pay far more attention to the conditions under which democracy promotion is likely to produce stable outcomes, while also recognizing that there are conditions under which it is likely to produce unstable outcomes. And therefore, there's a time and a place for democracy promotion. As I argue in Peacemaking from Above, Peace from Below, democracy promotion is very useful afterwards to help socialize a settlement that's already been reached for power politics reasons, pragmatic status reasons. But it's often a hindrance. It often gets in the way of reaching an agreement before an agreement is reached. And in some cases, therefore, where rival societies are intensely hostile, we may have to prioritize peacemaking in the short run and stability in the short run and worry about democracy promotion in the long run afterwards. Anyway, Asla asked me to talk for 45 minutes. I've done that. I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Very interestingly. The thing is, what do you mean, and I start already with pressing with the question, what do you mean by democracy? I remember, I can't say that off my head, have the quote off my head really, but in 1955 there were a series of very important polls which were made in Germany concerning the state of mind of Germans and their political attitudes and political opinions. And these polls were showing very well that democracy had not come in German minds. And this is why actually you make this reference to Weimar, which was a republic without republican, as it is well known, and then we come to the, jumping from one topic to the other, but it's all the same, to the liberal democracy. So in the 1950s, actually, yes, you quote these elections, I mean the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, the elections, etc. But the Germans were themselves were not believing in democracy. You could even argue, like late first name Ralph Dahrendorf, that it came only after 1968. In any case, whatever, but in the 1950s certainly not, so that you could very well make the argument that the French public had a number of reasons to believe that the Germans were not democratic at all. That being said, I would rather argue that the French were not aware, or that they were still full of prejudice and so on and so forth. But what is meant by democracy is a big a big question. You speak a second example, and I'm going on with the same kind of questioning. You speak of the peace process in Palestine, Israel-Palestine, which is now defunct maybe, and this is often the case. We can often speak about peace processes, but what about democratization processes? When is democracy? I would never have chosen the 1990s as an example of democratization of Palestine. I would rather argue that in the years 2000 you start having some kind of democratization process in the Palestinian Authority, notably due, for once, a little bit to the European Union and its pressures, but also and mainly and basically thanks to Salam Fayyad and the role he played as Prime Minister, wanting to introduce reforms and wanting to get rid of corruptions. So I was a bit puzzled by the choice of the time frame, because actually they don't fit. It could be well fit your argument actually that peace and democracy are divorced, but I would certainly not choose the 1990s to look at both democracy and peace in Palestine. So, to summarize, to some of the question is, what is the definition that you can give of democracy? Is there a point where democracy starts, or is this a democratization process? If you look at democracy according to elections, are we talking about maybe two illiberal democracies, or is it going to be judged in other ways? Then, if it's an appropriation by people, I mean, you mentioned top-down and bottom-up appropriation by people of democracy, then it takes a long time. And now I would want to make a sort of footnote or expansion a little bit on what you said concerning the French and the German, and maybe look at that generally speaking. I mean, you look at governments and public opinion, what were very important in these years too. You mentioned the Schuman and Pleven and so on and so forth, but also elites, what we call in French, I don't know the English word for that, passeurs, important intellectuals that like the Joseph Rovan, Alfred Grosser and others, people who played a very important role. It can be also organizations, civil societies, swimmings between cities, which started very early on in France and Germany. So you have, in other words, networks which may be very important and help do the connect between elites or leadership, the leadership you're talking about, which is very important, and public opinion. Let me just give you one example here, which is the Turkish-Greek relations. For a number of years in the interaction between people, networks, in other words, elites beneath the level of leadership and building bridges between societies. So these are maybe the 2 points I would like to press you on: democratization and then the networks.
Now you're expressing skepticism with that, and I think in a sense you are right under certain circumstances that procedures do not necessarily guarantee benevolent ideas. And certainly I think, you may look at a democracy in Iran as somewhat of an illiberal democracy, and not necessarily the same type of democracy that that we may understand in the West. And so there may be a little bit of a Western disease whereby Western democratic peace theorists assume that democracy is always going to look like the West. What I would say, though, to you is, and this really relates to the second question too, is that my own sense is that democracy, or this liberal democracy, or this changed attitude, which you equate with democracy, is something that takes a lot longer to build. And that's why in this book, new title that is Peacemaking from Above, Peace from Below, I argue that socialization of peace occurs over decades after a peace agreement, years if not decades, usually decades, as in the Franco-German case and other successful cases. And attitudes, therefore, change. And therefore, you can socialize the agreement and build the stability of the agreement over time. However, in order to reach a short-term resolution, you can reach those short-term resolutions based on statist interests, not based on democratization in the shorter term. And so as far as that goes, I think that is another problem, and I argue there in this book that that's another problem with the liberal policy prescriptions, these bottom-up policy prescriptions, including what you were suggesting, these people-to-people ties, this track to diplomacy, which is often used. That is wonderful after an agreement's already in place, but it's almost always, actually, I argue, looking in this book at the universe of cases of peace agreements between regional rivals during the 20th century, that it's always an insufficient basis to build a peace agreement. So afterwards, that's great. I think that's very useful, and I would agree with you. Beforehand, I don't think that that's the story of peacemaking. And worse, I think that those efforts in putting resources, as I argue in this book, putting resources into these people-to-people efforts and putting resources into this changing of attitudes, first of all, waste resources that could be put towards more effective strategies in the short term. And second of all, not only does it waste those resources, but it also gets in the way of peacemaking. For example, with non-democratic states who aren't interested in any efforts to democratize and aren't interested in people-to-people contacts that are going to change the attitudes. So therefore, you often have to engage in peacemaking with fixed conditions in the short run, sometimes propping up non-democratic states to do so in order to provide them with the incentives to make peace and stability, and worry about liberalization over the longer term. And that's a much more effective strategy.
I have a follow-up question on the definition of democracy. You started out by referring to the notion that democracies are not less likely to go to war than non-democracies. It's just that democracies don't fight other democracies. Now, then, of course, the question is that a hypothesis that is empirically verifiable? So we looked at the empirical evidence of whether this is the case, because if you have, then you obviously need a more operational definition of democracy. a dichotomy saying these countries are democracies, these are not, these are the ones who have been at war with each other. So I wonder if you also have looked at the empirical side of that question. Because if there is a research on that, there's obviously an operational definition of which countries are classified as democracies and which are not. The issue of democracy defined as process, yes, of course. I mean, this is, in a sense, the classical discussion on the state. And you have this notion, I guess, in all different type of theories, that there is both process and there's institution. And then you get various statements from various ideological positions and theoretical positions as to the importance of the institutions versus the importance of the processes. But I would imagine that, I mean, obviously in Marxist theory you have the sort of the classical Miliband-Polantzas debate about the state as a set of institutions versus the state as process. I presume you have that in liberal theory as well. So it's not either or, as far as I can understand. You need to look both at the institutions and at the processes. And then comes the historicity, that institutions do have history. And that goes even for perception. So I have some, I'm not quite sure if I think that your case studies clearly proves the point. Because there are specific issues in the case studies. Germany, France, in addition to what we've already heard, it's common sense that the French, for at least a decade, basically hated the Germans, or many French did. Now, if you asked a historian about that, he or she would also obviously say, yes, of course. I mean, because history didn't start in 1939. There was the First World War, and there were the regional wars between France and Germany over Alsace-Lorraine for a few hundred years, and it would probably go on for a few hours with all the conflicts over previous centuries. That it's crucial to understand why it wasn't only what happened during the Second World War that constituted what came after the Second World War. The Israeli-Palestinian debate, I think the crucial nature of that is that the terrorists on both sides were given veto power, because time and again after 93, you had processes of more or less real peace negotiations, and every time it was looking like we were getting closer to agreements, there was a bomb thrown. So that there were sort of terrorist attacks, and this goes for both sides, that disrupted the process. And the final point I'd like to make, just in relation to the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, simply that even though you may argue that one of the parties, Israel, is a democracy, and that there was some democratization on the Palestinian side, the peace negotiations themselves were not terribly democratic, they were not terribly inclusive at least, because the number of people who took part in the negotiations were limited, and decisions were taken without necessarily referring them back to democratic processes. Moreover, since both parties knew that their own people were split pretty much down the middle. So they would always say, aha, okay, if we decide on this, there's 49% who will support it and 51% who will be against. If we decide on the opposite, still pretty much of a balance. So the notion of the state of democracy isn't really that important in understanding why there was negotiations and why they didn't lead to the results.
You asked if there's research on the finding that democracies are about as war-prone with other states, and what kind of research there is on democracies not going to war with each other. That's not what I do. but there's a vast literature out there in political science, including an early contribution to this is one of our future speakers, Michael Doyle. But there are lists. Doyle looks at all, in 1984, two 1984 articles, looks at all democracies, all states between, I think he was looking at between the French Revolution, 1789, and the early 1980s. And no two states that he classified as democratic, this is very important, the qualification, no two states that he classified as democratic waged war against each other. Bruce Russett, in a 1993 book, I think it is, has another list of all states from 1815, from the Congress of Vienna, all the way to the early 1990s. And he calculates that, again, no two states that he designates as democratic waged war against each other. Now, you're correct to pull some of these little threads and see if you can rip apart the garment, because that's what a lot of the literature does. I mean, there's a whole discussion, debate about the democratic peace literature. There's a very rich literature on that, which questions how do you define democracy and who gets included in here, and and which cases get left out. So critics argue, what about the war of 1812? Right? If you include all states that were democratic for their time, because it's true that neither Britain nor the United States at the time had anything close to universal suffrage. They didn't even have anything close to universal male suffrage or universal white male suffrage. They only had propertied white male suffrage, which was very restricted. But they count it nonetheless in 1815. And Doyle counts them in 1789. So why doesn't that count as a war between democratic states, critics argue? Why doesn't the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, why not World War II, where technically Finland was in a state of war versus France and Germany? Why not Israel and Lebanon in 48 and 67, they say? Why not France and Germany and Weimar Germany in 1923 during the Ruhr occupation? And a few other potential, critics argue, potential misclassifications. And there's a lively debate on why certain things are included, certain not, but there's a lot of research on this that you might be interested in taking a look at. For the purposes of this talk, I proceeded with their definition of democracies and their assumption of it in order to address them on favorable grounds. But I think you're right to ask all these questions. Second of all, you ask about the nature of the history of conflict playing into these cases. Well, you're right that both of these cases are long-standing rivalries, or I might say enduring rivalries, which is the term used in the international relations literature, enduring rivalries. And I deliberately chose that. In fact, both of these cases are not in this book. Only one of these cases is in this forthcoming book. I couldn't include the Israeli-Palestinian case in the book because it was a non-state actor and I was looking at peacemaking between rival states, that is enduring rivalries. So I'm only looking at enduring rivalries with the assumption that if it's not an enduring rivalry, if it's just a conflict situation without use of force or without multiple uses of force, then it's a lot easier to resolve than the enduring rivalries. But if democratic peace theory offers us any kind of purchase over resolving troubled regions, as they suggest we can do, then they should be able to resolve enduring rivalries. And that's why I do look at these cases where there is a history of conflict between them, precisely for that reason. I suspect that the barriers to peacemaking might be a lot lower, as you suggest, in areas where you don't have this history of conflict. But again, my focus is on can we use this as a means of stabilizing conflict-prone regions? Because most of my work since since my dissertation, my entire career, I've been focusing on peacemaking and conflict resolution as my primary normative focus. Final thing you ask is, you mentioned that the peace process did not take place in the Israeli-Palestinian case within a democratic context. That is, there was a deliberate attempt to try to subvert the democracy, or not necessarily subvert, but short-circuit the democratic procedures that would lead to the defeat of the process. And I think you're right about that too. I mean, and this is consistent with realist exhortations. Traditional realists who argued, as I mentioned earlier, that democracies were flawed internationally, didn't claim, just as I don't claim we should abandon the idea of promoting democracy, which I think is a good overall over the long term. They didn't argue against democracy. They weren't saying that they'd rather see, they were all writing in the United States at the time, they weren't arguing in the 40s and 50s that they'd rather see an authoritarian state develop in the United States. What they were saying is, what they did say, and Morgenthau particularly struggled with this because he liked democracy and he thought it was the best system out there, but he wanted to try to mitigate these self-defeating aspects of it. And so Morgenthau's conclusion was that leaders should try wherever possible to engage in and exercise skillful leadership, to try to escape some of the democratic shackles wherever possible, and in order to be able to keep the democracy but still have the ability to do some of the things that you need to do internationally. Now again, he was skeptical that the circle could be squared in this manner, but he thought at least that was a better way of going about that. By the same token, I think that's what you see in successful examples of peacemaking. You have leaders taking choices that often skirt the democratic processes or try to make decisions with executive agreements in the United States, for example, rather than with a formal treaty that's going to be ratified, and try and you make decisions before you get ratification rather than consulting beforehand, consult afterwards in order to try to get the result that they would argue is in the national interest rather than going through these democratic procedures. So I think you're right about that. Your instinct is right. And in these cases, you do see attempts, but that doesn't work over the long term. And in fact, you know, I argue in an article I wrote a number of years ago, I argue that this idea of trying to escape domestic constraints and trying to escape the institutional and structural democratic constraints may be useful in the short term, but it comes at a high price. So Bidault, for example, agreed to the 1948 decisions to establish a federal republic of Germany that was a largely centralized, it was more centralized than the French wanted to agree to. And he did that, and he was thrown out of office afterwards. He was thrown out of the coalition afterwards, and for a number of years, he served simply as a member of the Assemblée Nationale rather than as foreign minister or within the cabinet. Rabin paid another kind of price by doing this. He paid with his life. So there are times when you risk paying prices, political or personal, if you do try to enhance what I call your autonomy and escape the constraints of the system. But sometimes that's how it's done.
To be liberal and all in favor of a free trade, as Richard Cobden said in the 1860s. But if you look at that basic principle today, free trade, which role would you say it plays? You have free trade, you have fair trade, you have controlled trade. It's a good thing, but not necessarily for me, and not necessarily in my backyard. But basically, what is the role today in liberal internationalism compared to, let's say, organized bilateral trades and smaller trade agreements? Now, back to this famous thing of democracy, the role of democracy in promoting peace. I have to say I never quite frankly understood neither the theory or the practice, even if you explained it very well. If you look at Europe in 1914, basically it was not to do with either peace or free trade, but because the main states in the northern tier, for some stupid reason, got entangled in a part of the world where they had nothing to do. I talk about the Belgrade, the Balkan questions. In 1886, in the Reich debate, in the German parliament debate on the Balkans, then, the old Chancellor Bismarck, he said, I'm going to say it in English because my German isn't all that good, but he said basically the whole question of the Balkans is not worth the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier. Mind you, he didn't even say a Prussian grenadier, he said a Pomeranian grenadier, which, as you know, belonged to the lowest hierarchy of the Prussian military. But again now, this precious word of democracy. Okay, but doesn't democracy really require a certain level of education and enlightenment and development? Doesn't the question of democracy require a certain feeling of give and take, of compromise, things like that? And that is when I look at the Middle East peace process, I'm struck with, in a heated atmosphere, where the conflict is about land, ethnicity, and religion, and a total lack of compromise in very many ways. I have to say, in the present format of negotiations, I have not unlimited confidence in that. On the Camp Davis negotiation and the Lincoln Perimeter, as you rightly said, I think the Israelis offered quite a lot on the West Bank things, also on Jerusalem. Which they again did, I think, following the talks, following the Annapolis conference in 2007, again turned down by the Palestinians, because I think the Palestinians and Arafat and the Palestinian leader in the post-Annapolis conference didn't really trust their own followers. They were basically afraid if they accepted perhaps some of them, of the Israeli proposals, they would end up with a dagger in their back, because their followers would not necessarily accept it. So democracy, yes, but fundamental lack of transparency, lack of confidence and trust, I think these are the elements which are lacking in the Middle East. And one final question on the Middle East. Instead of, let's say, just as an experiment, instead of engaging again too much in a two-state solution, would you possibly envisage the idea of, let's say, changing the format, going for a more regional approach? In comparison to the West Bank, Gaza, and then of course perhaps parts of Jordan, which could possibly form a kind of regional federation. Perhaps it's a little bit off the track, but anyway, I still stand with the question. Thank you.
Thank you. And since we are running out of time, I would like to latch on my question to Ambassador Berg's question. And this is more of a theoretical question. In your talk, you found traditional normative democratic peace, liberal theory to be found wanting in the case studies. And you found that neo-realism or structural realism and classical realism have their merits in each of the cases, pointing, as you noted, to neoclassical realism being perhaps the solution. I would ask you, there are clearly intervening variables at play here that leads to some democracies being peaceful and pressing towards a peaceful direction, and in other cases, the populace being more bellicose. Could you suggest to us what these variables are? Because, of course, one of the criticisms that has been leveled at neoclassical realism is the problem of uncontrolled proliferation of variables, which goes against the very principle of theorizing. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, Ambassador Berg and Asla, for those questions. Asla, I'm actually going to frustrate you first and tell you that we're probably better off talking about that over, over lunch or coffee, just because I'd have to talk to you at great length about the other project in order to get to that, and we have about 10 or 12 minutes left. So if you can wait for the answer or wait for a discussion of that much later, I think that would be most helpful. Ambassador Berg, you raised 3 questions. First is the role of free trade within liberal theory. And in a sense, there are 3 key components of liberal theory. The planks that Russet and O'Neill call the Kantian tripod of peace. That is democracy, international institutions, and the third is economic interdependence, which sometimes will be referred to as free trade. But the idea is that free trade tends to lead to economic interdependence, and that's why it should have sway over states. And there's a theory called commercial liberalism, which is one of these 3 components that assumes that states that are interdependent economically are less likely to use force against each other for 2 key reasons. First of all, because the opportunity costs of war in terms of trade and investment foregone, trade and investment tend to go down towards 0. Not exactly 0, but bilateral trade tend to go down toward 0 in the event of war. And in fact, their third-party costs as well as other investors tend to pull money out of conflict zones. And so therefore, the opportunity costs of trade and investment of force in terms of trade and investment tend to be a brake on the willingness to use force and downgrade or are countervailing pressures against any incentives to wage war. And the second argument is a comparative efficiency argument. That is, when trade and investment flow freely across national boundaries, they become a much more efficient means of extracting resources from territory than is the use of force, which of course requires you to mobilize an army, feed an army, pay for deaths and losses, etc., use weapons, and so therefore it becomes much more efficient simply to buy the damn thing that you want, or to invest in the company, to invest in the production and the like. There's also a sociological argument that, which is a different logic, but a sociological argument that trade breeds contact and contact breeds understanding. And so that is a very important theory that forms a component of the liberal international edifice. I actually, in work that I've done with Jean-Marc Blanchard, a few articles that I did, and a book that I've written with him on economic statecraft, ultimately take on that logic and argue that that's not actually how states think. And I suspect from your suggestions and comments in the second part of your question that you may actually tend to agree with that. But states don't necessarily privilege economic considerations over strategic ones. They are very attentive to them when economic considerations dovetail with or become strategic considerations. But overall, particularly in a crisis, national security considerations tend to trump economic ones, and so therefore, I personally tend to be less sympathetic about that argument in a conflict zone or in a conflict situation. I tend, as I was suggesting to Anne-Marie earlier, I tend to think that promoting economic interdependence is very useful after an agreement is reached in order to try to cement an agreement, to socialize an agreement afterwards, but it's not a very useful strategy beforehand. The second point you raised, is that ultimately, if you look back through history, putting my words on what you're saying, power politics dictated policy. Power politics dictated policy, and therefore you're suggesting that you would expect that to happen as well, or you would expect that democracy would have a hard time dictating politics, whereas power politics and state interests, particularly you suggest in a region where religion and ideology, you mentioned, and nationalism make compromise difficult, you would not expect democracy to have any traction, you were saying. The interesting thing is that in this forthcoming book, I look at cases of enduring rivalries, regional enduring rivalries. I don't look at enduring rivalries outside a region because I want to look at the most intense rivalries that are out there. I want to look at the ones that involve multiple wars, that involve territory, that involve religious differences between the parties, and try and figure out what brings peace in those cases. Israel did reach 2 peace agreements with neighboring states, with Arab states, with whom there are differing religions, with whom the territory at stake is of national significance as well, who have a history of bitterness and conflict, just like, it's not exactly the same intensity as Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's part and parcel of the same of the conflict, and the identities at stake are extreme, and yet they did reach peace agreements with them. So it is possible to achieve peacemaking under those circumstances. France and Germany, right now, we look back at it and we say, well, France and Germany, well, it's a different order of magnitude. It's not the same rivalry. But as was suggested earlier, the rivalry between France and Germany was extremely intense, nurtured, watered by the blood of 3 conflicts in 75 years, and the hatred was so intense. And yet they did find a path to peace. It wasn't a democratic path to peace, but they did find a path to peace. So I think it is useful. I don't think we can throw up our hands, or should throw up our hands and say, well, regional rivalries that have these multiple dimensions, religious, ideological, nationalist, and territorial, are just far too complicated to resolve. They're very complicated. We shouldn't expect a panacea, but there are circumstances under which these type of rivalries do resolve, and I think it's useful to investigate that. The final thing you asked really does deviate from what we're talking about here. You asked, is there a possibility of changing from a two-state solution or a negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians on one hand, and to try and regionalize that? That's an interesting question. The problem is that some of the solutions that you suggested, perhaps involving Jordanian territory in that, I don't think that's likely to happen. I mean, the Jordanians all have their particular national, the countries in the area all have their particular national interests at stake. There was an assumption that pan-Arabism might, certainly in the 60s, there was a discussion of pan-Arabism as a force. Nasser tried to promote pan-Arabism, but it wasn't a very successful notion. In general, the states as they exist have very strong national interests and that differ and that lead them into conflicts with each other. So the idea of regionalizing it would only be able to be done, I think, if you understood, if the states in the region understood themselves as having a common interest. The interesting thing is that perhaps, not a force for peacemaking, but perhaps the IS, the Islamic State, may revive this idea of common interests or moving beyond state interests in the region. But as I say, I don't think that's likely to help stabilize the region or inspire peacemaking.
First, we'll ask his question, and then the director of the Nobel Institute, Olav Njølstad, will ask his.
Thank you. Well, we have very little time left, and you have addressed some huge questions to which there are no definite answers. I thought you gave a fairly satisfactory overview of the theoretical debate. What I missed was some of the recent emphasis on transitions, because I think much of the debate has been dominated by definitional purity, and it has lost its relevance, really, because the democratic peace theory will prove its case, because the definition of democracy will be such that only those that are peaceful will live up to the definition. There are, of course, cases of democracies going to war. If no other example is offered, Finland and Great Britain were at war with each other during World War II. They were clearly both democracies. But this is not the nature of things. I mean, India and Pakistan, they've been at war, and they have tried to deal with this. This seems to have very little to do with the regime. And in the Middle East, of course, as you dealt with, all the emphasis on democracy. But Israel has peace agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, and the only democracy, Arab democracy, is Lebanon, of course. And their democracy does not seem to have been particularly important in the relationship. But my main point on transitions, because the world is messy. We don't have these pure examples. They are not of interest. I'll give you 2 examples. Of course, in the Balkans and in the Caucasus, the structures that developed in the 1990s, they were incredibly more democratic than the previous structures. Many of them had elections, but they were not accepted by the democratic peace theories as full democracies, but they were much more democratic than the previous structures. But they had much more war, and they had much more conflict. This is the real world we're talking about, not this archetypal cases which do not really have that much interest. Thank you.
Great question. I would say a couple of things. First of all, as I mentioned before, there is a literature that tries to pull the threads of democratic peace theory. And I think, in particular, people like Bruce Russell do this a lot. If you look at Grassland Democratic Peace, he even acknowledges these problematic cases. So he acknowledges 1815, he acknowledges the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States, and says, okay, well, why don't we classify this as a war between a democratic state? And he gives his first answer that, well, actually, my data set only goes back to 1815, using the small and Singer data set, and therefore I won't consider this case. But he acknowledges, at least he does acknowledge in a footnote, that that's probably not going to satisfy most readers, and so he gives another argument. His other reason for dismissing that case is that 1815 is prior to the Reform Act in Great Britain, and therefore the Reform Act really changed the nature of democracy in Great Britain and made it a democracy. Prior to that, we can't consider it a democracy, which is really a self-serving, I think, explanation, because he goes over initially, he takes great pains in arguing that a democracy is a democracy for its time, and Great Britain, even though it only had about 20% male suffrage, adult male suffrage, in the early 1800s, nonetheless will consider it a democracy, and same with the United States. So how, just because the Reform Act bumped it up to about 20% or a little bit more, and prior to that it may be around 12 or 13%, doesn't really address this issue and doesn't really satisfy critics. And there are a whole range of this. Why do they not include Israel-Lebanon? You mentioned Israel-Lebanon. Why do they not include Israel-Lebanon in 1948? Well, they will include it in 48 because he poses a 3-year rule, saying that a democracy needs 3 years to get credit. And so that eliminates the 48 case. What about 67? Both sides had 3 years at that point. He argues that there he invokes the Small and Singer definition of war. What's a war? 1,000 battle deaths in a given year. And he argued, well, you had 1,000 battle deaths in the 1967 war, but he argues those battle deaths did not distribute between Israel and Lebanon. They weren't inflicted by Israel on Lebanon or Lebanon on Israel, and therefore he says there wasn't really a war between Israel and Lebanon in this regard. The Finland case, they were technically at war, but of course there were no battle deaths there were not 1,000 battle deaths between Britain and Great Britain in World War II, so therefore he eliminates that. So I agree with you that they certainly draw the lines around it, and I think critics, and I really haven't engaged in this debate much, I have one article where I address this, but critics really get into, go into fine detail and challenge the whole evidentiary basis of the democratic peace literature, as you're suggesting. In terms of transitions, there's something else to it. And many of you are probably familiar with a colleague, a good friend of mine, Edward Mansfield, and his colleague, Jack Snyder, who have written about transitions to democracy. And they actually make the case that under certain circumstances, because initially they made a bolder case that they've come back to, but under certain circumstances, transitions can actually be much less stable than transitions that are incomplete, that fail to make the transition fully, are less stable than any other regime. And I actually, by their results, I think it makes a lot of sense. And so I would tend to agree with you that this attention to transitions matters. I didn't address that here because it's not really what I was focusing on, but I think the points you're making are well taken.
I have one question, and that is, I have some doubts about how well picked your two examples, your case studies are for the arguments you are making. And for one particular reason, it seems to me that in both these cases, Germany, West Germany and France in the early post-war years and Palestinian Authority in Israel in the 1990s, you have a very special situation where both parties were exceptionally dependent upon a third party, a very influential, very powerful party, also with a democracy. France's security in the early post-war years, of course, were very much dependent upon the presence of US forces in Germany. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Palestinians really had no one else to rely upon in the Western countries, and especially the United States. So in this situation, it must have been very strong incentives on both sides to do what the third party would like them to do. And that, in both cases, were to find peaceful solutions for the problems. So my question is really, how will you deal with this historical fact and the presence of a third very influential party that both of them are really dependent upon and which have a lot of power and influence on both of them? How will that affect the ability to make them, these cases, test cases for the democracy versus realism?
I'm glad you asked that question. And I'll tell you that this talk is based on an evaluation. It's based on a book and a couple of papers that I've done, but it's based on an evaluation of democratic peace theory versus structural and traditional realism as an explanation for regional stability, as a path to regional stability. And I'm looking in this case at, in this talk, I'm looking at cases of democracies that engaged in peace negotiations with democratizing entities. And that's actually a relatively small case as far as that goes, really relatively small universe. In the broader project, including this, which culminates in this book that's coming out at Cornell University Press next year, I look at a broader frame of states, societies, and peacemaking, statist interests, and I look at a variety of statist interests, particularly hegemonic pressures or great power pressures, which is exactly what you're talking about, and you're absolutely right that that matters a great deal as far as outcomes are concerned. Hegemonic pressures, great power pressures. A second statist pressure that I look at is the existence or the emergence of a larger threat, a more threatening state than the traditional rival. That also plays a role. And the third thing are state survival, regime survival, and leadership survival interests that the states have. That's the statist package. And so your consideration certainly factors in there versus a broader range of societal motives, including, as I mentioned to Ambassador Berg, commercial liberalism, the economic ties, economic interdependence, including liberal international institutions, including the state-to-nation imbalance that Benjamin Miller talks about as being influential, including democratic peace theory as one of these frames. And I look at what brings about in the universe of cases of successful peace agreements in the 20th century, which vary in their stability afterwards, what brings about success in reaching an agreement, and why do some of them survive or become more stable afterwards. And there I'd say you're absolutely right that hegemonic engagement is very useful. The statist motives are what leads to an agreement in the first instance, I argue. In the second instance, all these other bottom-up factors, these ideational factors, these institutional factors that matters. There are a whole range of other issues that matter, which again I detail, I discuss in great detail in the forthcoming book. Thank you all for your questions. I think they're wonderful.